Welcome to episode 50 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month I had the honor to speak to Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Dr. Gumbs is an author, poet, and prolific writer. Alexis co-edited Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines, and is author of Spill, Scenes of Black Feminist Fugivity, M-Archive, After the End of the World, Dub, Finding Ceremony, and her most recent book, which I can't recommend enough, Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. In this episode, Dr. Gumbs speaks on revolutionary mothering, unlearning domination, time, the academia-industrial complex, surrendering, listening, and Audre Lorde. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a brief jingle from a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero Network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
You grew up with parents who celebrated Black women writers and who took you to church because you loved school and wanted more school.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, could you explain a moment or part of the process when you started questioning the dominant narrative of white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy that many curriculum and propaganda runs on in the U.S.?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think the great thing about my parents, the greatest thing is that they really supported my interests, even if they didn't make any sense, period, or if they didn't make any sense to them. But they also did surround me with the work of Black women writers. So Sonia Sanchez's Poems for Children, Nikki Giovanni's Poems for Children, which have a critique of white supremacy at their core, were part of what I grew up with. And then, of course, I remember seeing my mom's copy of If They Come in the Morning, that anthology in honor of Angela Davis. And I always had questions about everything, right? And so in order to answer these questions about who's that? Who's that on the cover of this book? Basically, my parents had to explain white supremacist capitalism to me in the terms that they thought, could work for me. I remember my dad getting me Black Panthers for Beginners, Pan-Africanism for Beginners, Malcolm X for Beginners, and shout out to that amazing For Beginners series, because I think that it allowed an intergenerational conversation to happen. And I wouldn't say that it was always that my parents always knew or had the terminology to explain to me what was going on. I don't think it was until much later, I remember the brutality against Rodney King. And I remember that on the news. And I remember a school field trip being canceled because of it. But I didn't understand why it was upsetting to my parents in the way that it was, right? So I think that there's, in a way, for me, what that means is that understanding all the systems that you just named and understanding the emotional reality, reading the emotional reality of my parents has been something that's intertwined. And when I think about how did I become a critical thinker? How did I become somebody who decides to spend her time mulling over these questions and putting them in different poetic relationship to each other? I think that this is just how creative I have to be to understand the people that I love who are all impacted by the systems that you named.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And one thing I really liked is that you said on the Institute of Black Imagination that your parents trusted your voice. And I thought that was so powerful.
Thank you.
And then just about your history that you've shared too is so powerful. You talked about how your family is from the same area where Harriet Tubman is from in Maryland. And then just all the stories about your grandparents too, from Anguilla. Your grandmother was an organizer and involved with the church and did the 3 dolphin symbol as well. So I love hearing about how all these things coalesce together with all these stories. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
My next question was about your book, Revolutionary Mothering, and your dissertation was called We Can Learn to Mother Ourselves, The Queer Survival of Black Feminism. And I really like this quote that you wrote in Revolutionary Mothering. Mamas who unlearn domination by refusing to dominate their children, extended family and friends, community caregivers, radical child care collectives, all of us breaking cycles of abuse by deciding what we want to replicate for the past and what we need urgently to transform ourselves. It's just such a powerful quote on domination. And I was just wondering if you could kind of talk more about your view on domination in kids. You also talk a lot about intergenerational solidarity. I really liked that you said in one of your writings that listen to babies, they are teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, as you mentioned before, I did see my parents model that in a particular way by listening to me and allowing me to, considering me a teacher, which is a huge honor, and also was very, very much informs the way that I relate to the kids in my life, the young people in my life who are among my greatest teachers. The whole book, Revolutionary Mothering, and in particular, this conversation about domination and unlearning domination is core to, so that quote comes from an essay within the book, but it's dedicated to one of my co-editors, Maya Williams, who really, Revolutionary Mothering came from our conversations, which were long distance conversations. We barely have ever lived in the same country as each other, but she was talking about the experience that she had, that being a mother and raising her child was her first experience where she actually could potentially dominate someone, right? So like as a intersectionally oppressed Black woman, she had experienced domination in terms of systems and other people being able to dominate her because of her social position. But this was the one area in her life where if she decided she wanted to be totalitarian in relationship to this kid, there's nothing that this kid could do. Like that was the reality. And what it means to be like, oh, that's what domination is. And I have to refuse it. I have to refuse it in this instance where the child doesn't have recourse to really question my power. If I decide these are the types of things that we eat, if I decide these are the types of things that we're going to wear, this is where we're going to go, this is where we're not going to go, I actually have access to being in control of that to the extent that I can control that within the systems that I'm navigating. And it taught her something. And then her bringing it to me in conversation, it blew my mind. I was like, what? This is incredible, because this is what distinguishes revolutionary mothering, that it's happening on multiple scales. So it's happening in the instant between a parent and their child, or a caretaker and a child. And it also holds within it all of the complexity of what it would take for us to unlearn domination itself as a dominant relation in our species. Because what we have, domination as a dominant relation, means that we're in a context where it seems that either we have to be dominant or we're going to be dominated. Like that's the binary. Those are the only choices. And so the better choice is to dominate, because being dominated relates to so much violence and trauma and lack of self-determination, right? That many of us have experienced on multiple scales, right? So we think about the pervasiveness of abuse and sexual violence and child abuse and sexual violence against children that is formative of our collective psyche. And then we can see everything that we do, the cumulative result, which is heteropatriarchal racial capitalism, is trying to avoid being dominated by dominating something, being dominant at something, right? And these terms and derivatives of domination are used as if they are benign. Like to be dominant in your sport isn't seen as a violence, but the fact that that's what it takes to try to live a life free of domination, either by the financial rewards that come from being, quote, dominant in a sport, or the social capital, or how that accrues value to you as a person, is completely implicated in this place of violence. And in a conceptual frame like that, where it's dominate or be dominated, there is no life free from domination. Because if you're not being dominated, you are dominating, right? That's the conceptual frame. And so what I learned in that conversation with Maya was that, there is something other. There is something other than that other ourselves is this practice of saying there's a life-giving way to be in relation that does not surrender to this idea that domination or being dominated are the only forms of relation that we can have. In fact, there are other forms of relation that we've had the entire time. It's just that they're being obscured from the context in order to try to force us politically into these decisions where we dominate other people, or we fear that we're going to be dominated instead. So this ended up being why we chose to create this book, to say, well, let's look at that and let's ask the people who we understand to be having the most practice at this, the people who are actively mothering and who are marginalized mothers who don't have the privileges of domination that are normative. These are the experts. These are the geniuses. These are the practitioners. Their lives and their willingness to tell the truth about their stories, like Maya's willingness to tell her story to me. This is where we can see the infinity of relations that actually exist beyond domination.
Thank you so much for sharing that and breaking that open. My next question was from a line in Spill, and it relates to time. And you say, it was the way they invited futures with different angles and prismatic possibilities. And you often speak and write in non-linear ways, and you speak about the elasticity of time. I was wondering, since the pandemic, has your relationship with time changed, and are you interacting with it differently? And you've also spoke about the spiritual immune system as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my relationship to time is fascinating. I mean, the very beginning of my experience of the pandemic and of quarantining was like, I could not access linear time. And beyond not knowing like what day it was, I couldn't, clearly I'm still in it because I was late for this interview. I could not really hold on to what time is it? What time are these different things supposed to happen? And it's interestingly tied to my relationship to space because I stopped traveling. So my time had been structured by too much travel before the pandemic. And so I knew what time it was because I have to leave. Like that's my relationship to time was leaving, actually. I didn't understand that until I was able to see it because I wasn't completely in it anymore. I wasn't actually able to leave. I just had to stay and keep staying. And so it is interesting the way that time and space as relations are one relation, one complicated relation in the way that we're experiencing them. And it does resonate with what I do believe spiritually, which is that we do have access to all love across all time and across all space. And yeah, that's something that has been tested by the circumstances of the pandemic, because if I'm not, and I mentioned in response to your first question, how the people I love and like emotionally, physically, like reading the people I love is at the core of my practice. I'm very blessed that I live with someone who I love and that we were quarantined together, but all the other people that I love, I wasn't able to read them in the same way that I am able to when I'm physically with them. And so I had to really think about how do I live into what I believe, which is that all love is available across all time and across all space. How do I actualize that? How do I send my love when I can't send my body with it in an instance where I usually would? And so that's been transformative. I mean, that's something that's not like I figured it out and now I know. I'm still trying to figure that out. And it's also changed what it even is to be in person with people now that there are breaks of time where it has felt safe to be, with people in certain ways. So that's a long way of saying yes, it definitely has been impacted. I don't know if it means I have a different theory of time, space, and love. It's just that my practice has been very, very much challenged. And so I'm learning something in practice.
Thank you for sharing that. I have a friend who's been in prison for a long time, and he always tells me that he'll see me in the astral, and that's when he tries to visit me and stuff. Mm-hmm. So that makes me think about that as well, how we're not able to see each other at times.
Yeah. And I think that that's absolutely real. I mean, I think I think there's the oral. I think, part of what you do with this podcast and the collaborations that you have is about how do we send our love? How do we receive the love that is ours, that we're invited into by other people who we may not be able to be with physically. But I absolutely believe that your friend can meet you. You all can meet, because what disconnects us feels very real. And it is harmful, and it is part of our lived experience. But what connects us is actually infinite. It's actually infinite in form. And I'm so glad that he knows that there's that infinity of form in which you all can interact. And yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautiful to know.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks for saying that. My next question is, in M Archive, you write about the university industrial complex. I really like the quote where you say, this book itself also works to create textual possibilities for inquiry beyond individual scholarly authority. And I was wondering if you could talk about your work in and out of academia. And you've described this as another way to swim. And you talk about reclaiming energy used to reproduce academic institutions. And I really like one quote you said on a podcast. You said, your grandfather had said, I worked too hard to work for someone else. So I was wondering if you kind of talk about these hierarchies and how you kind of navigate these.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for all those references that you're giving me back to myself. Yeah, I do think that, it relates to what we were just talking about. I think that individuality as a form for organizing life is limited. It's limiting for a reason. It's a functional limitation. It allows particular systems to function and reproduce themselves. And yet, as multicellular beings, we are communities. And as your relation across and in astral space teaches us, we are not separate from each other in the ways that it would seem in our dominant normative system of understanding, that we would be separate from each other. And that carries, to me, that's most clear and felt in the practice of creativity and in the practice of scholarship, which to me, they're not separate. They're so deeply intertwined that it's hard to even describe them, anything about these distinctions. But I'll say that I do think about form often, and I am critical of form. And I think that you can see which forms are useful to reproduce what we have, say like a colonial education system or a colonizing educational system that we have. The idea that I'm a separate being with separate thoughts that belong to me personally and like started with me, and have this type of punctuation leads to this idea that we can be separated from each other. We can be individual units. And what's clear to me in my work, and my citational practice in M Archive, for example, is very specific about this, and citing M. Jackie Alexander on every single page, which is to say that even when I'm not in that particular practice where I'm doing that one page thing every day, I am constantly, whatever it is that I might be able to share, say, articulate, sound I'm able to make, it is in conversation with and building on all of this, so many things, some things that I can identify and cite, and some things that I'll never be able to even name. And what if I think you already are listening that way, even though what you're referring to other podcasts, you're referring to other texts, all of these different things that you're practicing what we know, which is that the conversation doesn't start or end. It continues, and we get to continue it I love thinking about this episode of the podcast in conversation with the episode with Joy James, right? Because I think about the way I think about mothering, the way that I think about possibility politics is in conversation with her and many more people. But she's just one of the people who I actually have heard and read and, seen these reflections in. And it's great to have something like the archive of the podcast that you're doing, which you're already putting in conversation with the other podcasts that you're listening to, and all that you're reading, and then the people that you're collaborating with and the conversations that you've been in. This is another space where we can practice our infinity.
Oh, I love that answer. Thank you. Yeah, I really love the citation, the way that you cite and write throughout that trilogy. It's so groundbreaking. And I think it's just what you were saying too about kind of like radical citations as well. When I was a teacher, I would tell students, you don't have to worry about citing, just say where you got it from, like a conversation. And I would get way better essays when I would do that sometimes, rather than having to pull out the APA handbook, and go through it all.
Yeah, to this day, I'm terrible at the form. Like I can't actually remember it. I have to look at it every time if I'm in a situation where they're saying you must cite in this way. It's like, yeah, it's hard. It's not actually organic to what our references are, what we're really referring to.
Thank you. I had heard someone once say too that APA is past tense, and it's kind of, it makes language dead. Unlike a conversation, what I thought was pretty deep.
That is deep.
I was wondering if you could talk more about surrendering. I really found that part very inspirational from Undrowned. And you've said what you do is beyond your ability was one of those key phrases about surrendering.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't even remember saying that, but I do think that I agree with it now. I think that's important. I think that comes out of being taught by and being in conversation with and disability justice leaders, and seeking to unlearn ableism within my own life and in my own practice and my own relationship to being, my own relationship to embodiment. And what is happening is not reducible to my ability, or really anyone's ability, even like our collective ability, quote unquote, as a species. What happens is not limited to that. And I think that there's a humility that is necessary. I think it's a necessary part of being in a peaceful, honest relationship with life and with this environment and ecology that we're a part of, to say that we're not making all this happen. There's so much happening. There's energy moving through. Part of it is moving through us. And it is a colonial, limiting, widgeting, fragmenting idea that says that I make it happen. And all that can happen is what I make happen or what I make you do, right? Coming back to this domination thing. And there's so much happening, not only that we can't claim that we made it happen, we can't even describe it, right? Let alone take credit for it. So yeah, I think that there's something humbling about that, but then there's something so exciting about that, because whatever the limits are that I think exist because of how I failed, because of what my capacity seems to be, all of those things, those aren't the real limits. Something more than that actually can happen. And surrendering to that becomes important because for me, because my ideas about power inside this context of domination that we spoke about have really been internalized. Like I have to control what I can control, right? And basically all that I've been able to control or imagine that I could control is me. So then I have to dominate myself such that I do the right thing, say the right thing, do enough, be enough, prove that I'm smart enough. Like I could control that, right? And so there's a train going by. So can you hear it?
Oh yeah, it sounds cool. It's not that loud.
Yeah, that I realized relatively belatedly that I was dominating myself with this idea of control and with this fantasy that I could control a piece of what could happen. And it's, first of all, it is a fantasy. Like I'm really not in control, not even of myself. And then second of all, there's a greater possibility than anything that I could imagine, control, make up, make happen, that is possible. And I love that possibility. And what if I just allow myself to fully love that possibility, to even love myself as part of that possibility, to love each of us as part of that possibility, as opposed to different individual units that are going to constantly fail whatever it is that I would make up, right? They are not going to match whatever it is that I would imagine myself. So yeah, it's the possibility that challenging ableism and thinking about what violent uses the idea of ability serves in capitalism that have helped me to surrender to something bigger. It's bigger even than what seem like totalizing systems that are created out of actually human desire to control.
Oh, thank you for that. I love that. I feel like the train was part of the teacher in there.
Exactly.
We had to surrender to the train. And,
right.
And also a whole other part that's really coupled throughout Undrowned and Surrendering that I read was listening. And you talk about the whale that was discovered in 1741. And then you talk about the danger of being discovered and how it went extinct. And I really loved the part where you say, they say she couldn't sing. The only sound was her breathing, but she could hear for miles and miles and miles. What a loss for listening. How can we honor it? The archive of your breathing. And I really thought that was just so powerful. I was wondering if you could expand on that more. And also towards the end of the book, you talked about the sea monster ancestor of the contemporary sperm whale, a so-called sea monster. This was named after the Leviathan Melville. And you talk about how it has the largest, sharpest teeth, but they're used for echolocation and listening. You say that what was made to puncture you could now be used to listen deeply. I thought that was so good.
Yeah. I mean, part of why that resonates with me so much is that's been part of my surrender. Like part of what I've had to learn is how powerful listening is, where, as you mentioned before, I grew up with parents who supported my voice and very much also raised in political movements once I found them that were saying, raise your voice, and like your voice is powerful and your voice is necessary. And I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I thought that the sharpness of my critique was the thing, that's what will protect me. That's what will keep me safe. But then when you study marine mammals who are navigating the ocean of possibility, just like we're navigating its infinite space of possibility, what is it that they need? They need to be able to listen further than they need to be able to project their voices. Now, blue whales can project their voices. Okay. Oh, how wonderful. Speaking of being in conversation, that's actually beloved mentor of mine, Farah Jasmine Griffin, who is actually saying that she's heard, she's saying my name was being called somewhere else. So, so it's a conversation, as I said, it's infinite. It's happening all at the same time and forever, even through that Facebook message. But that means that the depth of our listening and the capacity of our listening is so important. It may be the most important thing. And what if our practices reflected that importance? What if, so I'm a writer, right? What if the time that I spend, which is a lot of time, writing and wanting to be with that and learn about my voice and the nuance, what I can possibly say, what can I offer, all of that. How can I archive the unsayable through this poetic, this is what I'm thinking about. What if my practice could be, and this is what I'm seeking towards, and even the writing has to then be in service of that, what if it was the nuance of my listening? What if that's what I was practicing? The possibility of what I might be able to be receptive to. And when I think about that, I think about it in terms of the nonlinearity that you talked about before. Like, what will it take? What will it take for me to listen, for example, to Hydromammalus gigas, this animal that was extinct very long before we were born? Could I actually relate to my listening in such a way that I could listen that expansively across time and space? And how would that happen? And what would be the practices that I could do that would invite that receptivity? That's what I think about listening, and I think it's such an interesting thing. We're engaging in the form of a podcast, right? And people listen, and I listen to your podcast, and it is interesting. I think that it may play a role in how I'm able to then listen differently to other people or to other life forms. It does also create an asynchronous archive of possible listening. And it's something, I don't think there's any of us who don't need to practice listening more. I know for sure I need to. And I feel like our whole species could benefit from really valuing listening.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I was wondering if you could give maybe some of the journey from the chapter Archive of Ocean from MArchive to Undrowned. And I really like the phrase you use, Ghost of Ocean. And I was wondering what new portals have been opened or are opening since those writings.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, because so there's the Archive of Ocean in MArchive, and that most of MArchive I was listening, right? And I'm like engaging these images, and I'm like, what is this? Like where is this? And a really memorable one in terms of Archive of Ocean is this time where there's this being, and this being is at the surface of the ocean, is somehow related to us, but evolved beyond our relationship to surface and depth. And that I thought of that as a future, but it also connected me to a past and history, and the history, the reality of being related to marine mammals, and being related because we're all related and we're all one. And as mammals, we got we come together, we come from each other, but also because of what I then get to in Undrowned, a shared. Well, I think I really get there in Dub, and I'm already kind of there in MArchive, I guess. The non-linearity is real, but that we're related also because of the concepts that ensnare us and harm us as this entire way of understanding life that is, again, trapped in this another train. It would be really cool if the train is actually part of this listening. Everybody gets to listen to this train, or series of trains that are going by my window. But yeah, that we're related through what we've been through, what we go through, what the implications are of these dominant frameworks. But we're also related before that, and we're also related after that. And what is that aspect of relation that is bigger, is before and after, is perceivable to me through the systems that I'm surviving, but is actually not contained by those systems and their limitations. So I continue to reach for that. And in Dub, that's the listening project of like, okay, there's the whole whale chorus, and like, what is that? There's the choral speaking. There's my understanding that ancestral listening is interspecies as a listening practice, and interplanetary. Ultimately, it's just I don't really know exactly how I'm listening interplanetarily yet. And so Undrowned is the practice of that listening, the repeated practice of that listening in a specific way, right? So because the practice of Undrowned, the practice documented in Undrowned is specifically to listen to what the lived example of a particular marine mammal could teach me on a particular day. And I think that I wouldn't have done that practice if I didn't learn the value of what that practice could mean from these revelations in MArchive and in Dub of what it means to listen and how marine mammals continue to recur and assert themselves in my experience as important teachers for me.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I really love all the interspecies solidarity that you bring out in Undrowned. It's so inspiring, and the manta rays, how they all get in a circle and feed each other. I love that.
That could be us. This could be us, but we tripping. And revolutionary mothering teaches it is us, right? Like that sharing is happening. It's just we're taught that couldn't be the whole thing when it could be the whole thing, how we share.
Yeah, and in Dub, you say, when did we start to hide food from each other?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's such a deep question. I have too many questions. Let me answer.
Same.
In MArchive, I kind of had a question about climate change, climate catastrophe. You say it was ultimately the water that transformed how they thought of the concept of debt.
Mm-hmm.
And you've also talked about internal climate change too. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk on these two concepts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, part of the record of MArchive is how do the people begin to understand themselves as planets, right? And it really comes in the lineage of Toni Cade Bambara, who teaches that everything is happening. The same thing is happening, but it's happening on every scale, and there's infinite scales. And the quote unquote person is an example of a scale, and the planet is an example of a scale, and the cell is an example of a scale. Both the physical organic cell and the containment prison cell, all of those are scales. And on all of those levels, this idea, if we really are honest about water, then we can understand the dishonesty and real nonsense of the idea of debt, for example, the idea of speculative capital, the idea of an NFT, the idea of a neoliberalist capitalist economy that we have, which is the lie that harms the planet, that harms our relationship with the planet, I'll say, because water, you have to have it. It's there or it's not there. It's not separate, right? And debt requires a concept of separation. Without separation, of course, there can be no debt because it's just life, right? But water, though, of course, it's being hoarded as a resource, it's being polluted and destroyed as a resource. At this point, it's being thought about differently because, with rising temperatures and also rising oceans, and, all of this is having people think about water differently. But if we were really to get what water is teaching us, and this is part of what Jackie Alexander explains in terms of the quality of water, we would understand that it means that we can't actually separate what gives life to us. It can't be separate because it's all interconnected. And yeah, so I think that's what I was thinking about there. I don't remember the second half of the question right now, or maybe that was the whole question.
Yeah, that was the whole question. I believe.
Okay.
Internal climate change.
Right. So that's happening on every scale, right? And like you said, I mean, I just drank my whole thing of water right before we talked. But like you said, right, be sure if you want to get water, if you need to, this is happening on the same scales, right? The water within me and the water, which is a huge percentage of this community that I am, in terms of what the molecules are, water, bacteria, it's basically what's going on here. And also the planet, the water is the water, and it's crucial. And that's happening on the scale of the planet that looks like, this is the body of Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and it's happening on the scale of the planet that looks like Earth, and it's not separate.
Thank you. Yeah, and talking about breaking these binaries down, you had mentioned how Audre Lorde challenged the binary between star and planet.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more as well.
Yeah. Oh, you have read everything. That's great. You're like out here reading in German, everything. So, yes. So, yeah, that's one of the things that has been really fascinating to me. So I'm writing a biography called The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde and she's not the only person who did this, but she talks about star as planet. So she'll say, I feel like I'm alone on a cold and distant star, or I'm imagining life on other stars. And I mean, first of all, it makes sense, because if you look at the sky and you look at the stars and you look at the planets, it's like, it's light. We don't know. I mean, we do know, because is it light reflected or is it light that is combusting off of these stars? That is considered to be the distinction between a planet and a star. But because this planet, for example, or any planet, is still in a dynamic process, like a star is in a dynamic process, we could, at a certain point, you just have to say, this process is solid enough, it's stable in particular ways, this is a planet, this is not a star. But then at the same time, it's like, but it's all made of stardust, So like, is it a star? Is it not a star? So I think it's an interesting poetic possibility. And what it makes me think, and what I wrote about in the preface to A Burst of Light, the new edition of A Burst of Light translated into German, is what if so I was like, okay, we can understand ourselves as planets. And I was like, oh, well, we have to understand ourselves as stars, right? If planets are stars, and what does that mean? And what does Audre Lorde thought about mortality in this sense as a burst of light. And she wrote about that from when she was 14 years old. She wrote in her notebooks this idea about a star coming, a shooting star though. So really it's not a star, it's a meteor. There's all of this cosmic conflation that to me is really generative, because what I was just saying, then it doesn't hold on to this idea of separation, right? We have these distinctions so that we can understand, well, a meteor is like a piece of space dust, but it's a meteor when it's traveling through the atmosphere and gets on fire because of that. And we can see it from here for these reasons. And then a planet is orbiting, and then a star is combusting, all of these things. But it's all the case for all of it. The planet is also on fire. The planet is also combusting. And we are also all of that. We are also that dynamic, and all of that is within us. So I think that Audre Lorde gives us this invitation, and through her own practice, right? She's thinking about herself on cosmic terms. And that had huge implications for the way that she lived, and the choices that she made, and the relationships that she cultivated, and the legacy that she continues to activate at this very moment. And what if we learned from that? What if we thought about ourselves, our relationships on cosmic terms?
Thank you for that. And that's your upcoming book is going to be about Audre Lorde. And
yes,
you described this as the Lordian guide to the universe.
Yeah.
It was my last question. When you were in the Spelman College archive, I was wondering what surprised you, or how was it to interact with her artifacts?
It was such an incredible experience each time. So I visited the archive multiple times, and the first time there were the most surprises, of course, because I guess the first time you're doing something, but it was very moving. It was very moving to touch the letters she had held. It was very moving to open her journals and read them. The most surprising thing, though, were some of the artifacts that were beyond some of the categories, like archival categories. And because I was the first researcher to go there, they had just been processed, and they're further in their process now. And there are things, there's a lot more clarity about what is what and what is where at the Spelman College archives in the Audre Lorde papers now. But at that time, there wasn't as much clarity. And so I remember opening one box and I was like, oh, this might be some kind of ephemera. Like, it's not in the finding aid, it's just like ephemera. So ephemera means like it could just be anything. It's just probably not letters or manuscripts like most of the materials are. And I opened it and it was a box of Audre Lorde's hair, her locks after she had cut them, which she did very late in the game because she decided she wanted to cut them so that they wouldn't be damaged by the radiation and chemotherapy that she ultimately had to do at the very end of her life in order to continue to live a little bit longer. So she wanted the dignity of that and she wanted her hair intact. And so she spoke with her friend Andaye about that. And that was a spiritual decision that she made. But I didn't know that it was part of the archival papers, that it would be in there. And I opened it and I felt this like, still don't even know how to describe what I felt in that moment, that there is an intimacy to having someone's hair close to you. Now, respectfully, it's not like I dug my hands through, like I was like, this is, not necessarily something to be touched, but it broke down a different binary between aliveness and death for me. There's no way I ever thought I would be anywhere close to Audre Lorde's hair, right? Like her books, her poetry, yes. Her artifacts in terms of the manuscripts, that even was a whole another level for me. But the organic material of her body, of her skin that had transformed to hair, that she had grown into these locks, I never thought I would encounter that because I didn't meet her in this lifetime. So yeah, I'm still processing that. That was definitely the most surprising experience I had in the archives.
Wow, thank you for sharing that story with me. Appreciate that. But thank you so much for doing this interview, Dr. Gumbs. It's been a pleasure for me, and I love your work, so it's an honor to speak to you. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Time Talks podcast. Please support Dr. Gumbs and pick up all of her books. Alexis's forthcoming book is The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde. I want to thank Dr. Gumbs for taking the time to speak on the podcast, and thank you to Awareness for the music, and see you next time.